and say good afternoon. This is Hour of the Wolf. I am with Alan Dean Foster. This is actually our second time doing an interview. The first time was some 19 years ago, and we've had a lot of technical problems here. The other time was face to face, and we also almost had a lot of technical problems that had to do with the politics of the convention we were attending.
Oh, yes.
There's always politics there. If you don't know Alan's work, minor things, Star Wars, Star Trek, Alien, and the subsequent 2 books at least. Lots and lots of stuff that some other people have to end up doing as work for hire, but Alan commands contracts, the real thing, which not everybody does. Coincidentally, we're going to be talking a bit about that. I will be blunt, and I will trust you're not going to be upset if I mention that personally, I like your own universes. Like Pip and Flinks. I think that, about 1972, thereabouts, I think was the first thing of yours that I read. And
those were the first things I wrote.
Well, then. So I guess
my first story came out in Analog in June of 1971. And my first novel, which was the first Pip and Flinks book, The Time Crank, came out in 1972. So it's not like you missed anything from the beginning.
There you go. Who was that published by?
It was originally Ballantine Books. It was still Ballantine Books. Betty Ballantine bought the book, actually.
I finally got
it. It was then turned over to Judy Lynn Del Rey and Lester Del Rey.
Yeah.
Subsequent to that, but it was Betty who bought the first book.
Wow. Okay. And so that's right there, wonderful pedigree. And what are the others? How many books do you have? Any idea?
It's a little over 130 at this point.
Is that all?
Yeah, and short stories and columns and reviews. And, it's been a life of writing, basically. I like telling stories. I'm not a fanatic like Isaac Asimov, who Isaac's idea of a vacation was to go into a room and lock himself in and write. That was his vacation from writing, was writing somewhere. But I don't do that. I do take breaks, but I love telling stories.
I think you have surpassed him in terms of a number of works of fiction, because so much of what he wrote was science and nonfiction and autobiography.
That's possible. I don't know. I don't keep track of these things, but people do. So I have to keep numbers handy, I guess. It's just been it's just been a fun, long ride. And it's interesting. Some people, I've learned over the course of my career, you can write something and somebody will love it and somebody else will hate it. And then you'll write something else. And those two people will exactly reverse their opinions. The first one will hate it and the second one will love it. And you're writing the same style and it's still your voice talking. But because of the subject matter or the approach, people will have diametrically opposed opinions about your work. And what that tells you, or tells me anyway, as a creative person, is you might as well do what pleases you, because in the end, you're not going to be able to please anybody no matter what you do.
Now, I mentioned that you wrote a book called Star Wars.
I remember that book.
There was a different name on the cover. Some guy named George Lucas. And I'm friends with Chris Claremont, who wrote the Willow trilogy. Only first book was George Lucas. Second book was George Lucas and Chris Claremont. Third book was Chris Claremont and George Lucas. What was your experience working with Lucas, and how did you feel about not having your name on the cover of, while it may not have been your story, it was still a book that you wrote?
I didn't see George that much. He was busy making this little movie. And if you've ever been around if you've ever been around a proper film production, there is literally no time for anything except working on the film. I was frankly astonished that he had any time for me at all. But the couple of brief meetings we had, they went very smoothly. I felt we were on the same page, no pun intended. And it was very basically, he was a guy who loved, this was my take, was a guy who loved old serials and science fiction films and comics. And because nobody else was making the movie he wanted to see, he went ahead and made that movie. And we, as far as I know, I never heard any differently. We got along just fine. And he's one of these people who, if I ran into him in a room tomorrow, and I haven't seen him in many, well, in decades, but if I ran into him in a room tomorrow, we just start talking. You know how it is with people like that. If you're on the same wavelength, you just pick up conversations from wherever they left off. So that was my experience working with George. As
Yeah,
far as not having my name on the cover of the book, that didn't bother me at all. It's not my universe. I didn't create it. It was in the contract. And if you're a professional, if you sign a contract, you adhere to the terms of the contract. But it never bothered me. I didn't create Star Wars. I had nothing whatsoever to do with the creation or the origination of Star Wars. I just did an adaptation of it into book form. And if George wanted his name on it, that was fine with me.
now, on the other hand, when he was making Star Wars, he had no idea that it was going to be the phenomenon that it was. So you wrote a book that was sort of a just in case the Empire wouldn't strike back.
That's right. George was, I'm sure George, although we never had time to talk about this, was a great student of Walt Disney. And Walt Disney, of course, is, among other things, known from a business standpoint of view, uh, for looking ahead. And George, I think, was always looking ahead. And the idea with Splinter of the Mind's Eye was, and this was a 2-book contract, it was in the same contract as Star Wars, the novelization. I'm sure, George, the idea was that, as I understand it, the first film, if the first film was not a big success, but not a big failure, he would be able to make a second film, a follow-up film, not necessarily a sequel, but a follow-up film that could be made on a much lower budget, utilizing as many of the uh, costumes and props and backgrounds as possible from the first film. So I was given the task with the second film of writing a book which could be filmed on a low budget, keeping those notions in mind, which is why I set the story on a fog-shrouded planet. Remember, there's no CGI back then. Much easier to film backgrounds when everything's obscured by fog, and largely underground. Same thing. It's a lot easier to do tunnels than full backgrounds. And on that basis, I went ahead and wrote the book.
How did you learn the film craft in order to write what was, in essence, an Uber treatment for a movie?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Well, I have a Master of Fine Arts in Theater Arts, specializing in film from UCLA. And so I actually have a degree in this stuff, none of which did me any good really when I was getting into writing, because I went a different direction. I didn't go into film. I tried. There were a couple of near misses, as so often happens in the film business. There was a young would-be producer sleeping on his mother's couch in her apartment off Hollywood Boulevard, trying to do the same thing, get into films. And he got a little option money together and optioned a couple of Robert Bloch short stories and put a notice up on the bulletin board in the UCLA film department asking for somebody to try and turn these into screenplays for free at that point. And I'd always been a fast writer, and I thought this would be good experience. So we got together and I did that. And one of those was almost picked up by ABC Films at that time. It would have been a movie for TV. but it just didn't happen because Bob Bloch's, I didn't know Bob at the time. Bob Bloch's agents wanted too much money for the rights to develop. And so it didn't happen. That young guy sleeping on his mother's couch was Ronald Shusett, who later went on to do, as a producer, mostly Alien, Total Recall, another science fiction fan who got into film in a big way.
Mhm.
We also got along fine, by the way. So you would see these things crop up along the way. I did a 2-part Batman episode for the TV series. I wrote that while I was still at UCLA because my uncle, Howie Horowitz, was the producer of the show. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better in than that. And he read it and he didn't buy it. But again, it was good experience. It's just like practicing the piano. The more you do, the better hopefully you get at it. I wrote a 2-part script. I wrote a script for a 2-part episode for Star Trek, the TV show, the original TV show, and sent it into Norway Productions, which was Gene Roddenberry's production company at Paramount. Got a very nice letter back, which I still have somewhere, saying, thank you very much for your submission. Remember, I'm nobody at this time. I haven't sold anything. Thank you very much for your submission. We like your story very much. Please resubmit for our 4th season. Of course, there was no 4th season.
Right.
That 2-part TV episode script was eventually adapted by me for the last 2/3 of Star Trek Log 7, the book. So I did get some use out of it anyway.
Yeah.
I kept trying and trying and trying to get into film and never quite did. Meanwhile, I sold a couple of short stories and then Betty Ballantyne bought the novel. So I ended up going a different direction with my career.
And it's been an immense one and very popular. That also explains why so much of your work is novelizations, not just the work of your own universes that you've created, and there are several of them, but also the Star Trek books, the Alien books, and how many Star Wars books?
Star Wars books 4.
Okay.
Star Wars, Splinter the Mind's Eye, the novelization of The Force Awakens, and an original novel set between episodes 1 and 2 called The Approaching Storm.
It would be interesting to see now that it's an open franchise if they would revisit those.
How do you mean revisit?
Well, they're doing all kinds of Star Wars stuff. The Mandalorian was but the first. It's about another 8 different storylines that they're pursuing, plus feature films. They created Rogue One, which was placed just before what they renamed Episode 4, A New Hope. I call it Star Wars. Uh, so they're doing all of this interstitial work and other series within that universe.
Well, that's the way they should go. I mean, they made the right decision with Rogue One, and The Mandalorian obviously has been a huge success for Disney. And I think that's the direction they should go. The Star Wars universe is large enough to where breaking away from the original storyline is probably, from a story standpoint, the best way to go. They're not encumbered by what's gone before. In fact, I think they should break even further away and forget about the original stuff altogether. You can only do sequels for so long. Sequels are extremely difficult to do properly.
And prequels.
Yeah, whether they're prequels are even harder because you know what's going to happen afterwards. And with sequels, you at least, particularly if it's a true sequel, you know the major storyline. You probably know a lot of the major characters. And I think going off in a different direction, even more so than The Mandalorian, would probably benefit Disney and the whole Star Wars universe a great deal. But since I don't run a studio or that studio, I can't do that.
You could pitch them.
I did pitch them. I pitched before episode 8 came out, simply as a fan, really. I wrote a treatment, not a complete treatment. It was a little was weighted towards the front and the back of the story, but it was a full treatment. For episode 9, trying to retcon, like any fan did, probably like every fan did,
Mhm.
all of the errors and mistakes and problems that materialized in episode 8. And my agent could not get anybody at Disney to look at it, probably because the film was already in production, but for whatever reason. But I did that and I posted it online. It's available for anybody to read who wants to. And it's proven interestingly controversial. Some people hate it, and some people really like it. And just what I've mentioned before, no matter what you do, somebody's going to like it, somebody's going to hate it.
There are people
I would have written something,
episode 9 and vice versa.
I would have written something completely different if I had just gone from episode 7 to episode 8. But having to go from episode 8 to episode 9 entailed dealing with a whole bunch of other things that I would not have put in episode 8. So you approach it from different ways. But I had fun doing it.
Yeah. So, well, they are going in all kinds of different directions. They made one solo film, and it didn't do that well, so I don't know if they're going to do more. I liked it, but I may have been the one who did. And it's a huge franchise. It can go splinter off. Even The Mandalorian is going to have its own spin-offs.
Well, that's what you do if you have a franchise that big and you intend to continue with it, is you try different things. I mean, from a studio standpoint, you hope all of them hit. But if one hits and another one doesn't hit, then at least you have options. So I think that's, they're definitely going the right direction with that.
Yeah, I would just personally like to see something with your name on something other than the spine of the book, as far as these universes are concerned. Star Trek is going other directions as well.
Yes. Well, of course, I did write the treatment for the first Star Trek movie.
Did you?
Yes, that's. You see the film. My name's up there. It says story by. It's there for about half a second, and
I've forgotten it. So before Robert Wise's name.
That's right. Well, I don't remember the order. Usually they try to put the director up last.
Well, he's the director, so.
Right. I blame the French for that. This whole auteur theory of filmmaking, when it's really a gigantic cooperative enterprise.
Yeah.
But be that as it may, I did do that. It was not a pleasant experience. I'm happy with the result, but I would have been a lot happier if I'd been able to work on the final actual screenplay, as opposed to just turning in the treatment.
Yeah.
But it is what it is. The first 5 minutes of that film is all mine. I can claim that.
That's the best part of the film.
I can claim credit for making Kirk an admiral. I thought enough time had passed where he needed a promotion. And, these things, if you don't live in Los Angeles and you're not around the business, you know this.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to embed yourself in the process of making films. If you want to be a country singer, you need to go to Nashville or Austin. If you want to be on the stage, you really should be in New York. Or London. There are certain centers for these sorts of creative activities. And having made the decision to move to Prescott, Arizona, it becomes difficult to engage properly with the mechanics of the film industry. People can do it. John Huston used to live in Mexico, and nobody seemed to have any problem hiring him, but he was John Huston.
Yeah.
So I'm not, I'm not any Houston. But that's really what you have to do if you want to do it. And I just decided to go a different direction with my life. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, it would be nice. Be nice to write a film. I've actually written screenplays which have been optioned. They're just not produced. For every screenplay that gets made, there's at least 100 that are actually optioned that still never get made.
Right.
I have one recent one that came very close. was co-written with a wonderful young author named Joe Burke called Olympus, which is about the first settlement on Mars, and was intended to be a U.S.-China co-production shot in China. And it didn't happen, not because of politics. It just, like so many film projects, after the lawyers working on the contract details for something like 6 months, suddenly it evaporated. That's another reason for not going into the film business. It will break your heart.
Yeah. I've never been near any of that. I have done the tiniest bit of stuff in theater, and for God knows what reason, the dice were rolled and it was tremendously successful. So I quit. I'm back to working for free in radio.
I think it's important to do in your life, if you're very fortunate, to do something that you enjoy doing. There are I've met plenty of people who made a great deal of money. Not plenty of people. I've met people who made a great deal of money doing stuff that they hated. And every once in a while, one of them picks up and moves to Idaho to do chainsaw sculptures out of trees because they don't want to be in the stock market anymore and they don't want to be bankers anymore. And there are things in life besides money. Not to shock anybody, but there really are.
Yeah, it happens.
Yeah.
Now, some people that write novelizations end up, they just write the book. I don't know if they even ever find out that it earns out, is the phrase that is used, meaning that it makes the money that the publisher spent, and now profits are rolling in. And then some things that are work for hire, this is especially true in the comics industry, where you can create a character and they can make movies of those characters and those stories that you wrote for comics and never ever receive a penny. I mentioned Chris Claremont, on whom most of the first X-Men movies were based, including Days of Future Past and so forth. And he did not get paid for that because that was the contract. That was the way it was done, work for hire. You work differently. You work with contracts that hopefully the books earn out, the property earns out, and then people pay residuals. We all know where I'm going with this.
Yes, and we'll get there shortly. I have no doubt. I've done both, actually, Jim. I've had contracts for book adaptations where you get an advance against royalties.
Right.
If the advance earns out, then you get royalties. And I have also done books where I was given the option to take a lower royalty against a higher advance, or a still higher advance and no royalty. In other words, a flat fee piece of work. And I did that on several occasions because the flat fee I felt was sufficient for what I was doing. And when I'm given the choice, I ask to see the screenplay first before I sign the contract. And if I think the film's going to be crap, then I take the higher advance. It's nice to have that choice. Doesn't always happen that way. Usually doesn't happen that way, but it has happened in the past sometimes. For example, on Crow, on the book version of Crow, I read the screenplay, and it's a very pretty movie. It just doesn't make any sense. I read the screenplay and I thought, well, these people have no idea that there's a difference between science fiction and fantasy. And maybe they think that by combining the two, they'll get the best of both worlds. And of course, the opposite is true. You get the worst of both worlds because they don't mesh. So I took the higher flat fee that was offered and declined any advance. And that was the right choice on that particular film. But I don't always have that option.
Now, when it comes to now you took that option to get residuals and stuff on at least the Star Wars books and the Alien books.
Okay. Let's do Star Wars first. Uh, the first two books, Star Wars and Splinter of the Mind's Eye, as I mentioned earlier, were one contract. And then subsequently with The Force Awakens and The Approaching Storm, those were set contracts. I wasn't given the option there, which was fine. I got an advance against royalties on both of those books. The first two, the second book, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, is an original novel and had a fairly standard original novel setup. I was given an advance, and then the royalty rate was spelled out in the contract. With the first book, the adaptation of the original film, it was originally a flat fee job, which I took anyway, because I thought I could do a good job with it, and for various reasons. And we had a story meeting one day at George's. He was renting office space on the Universal Studio lot. There was no such thing as the ranch or Lucasfilm formal offices. And it was myself, George, the producer, Gary Kurtz, and Charlie Lippincott, who was in charge of advertising promotion. And in the course of the conversation, which was to discuss mostly Splinter, because that was my story and had to discuss it with everybody involved. In the course of that, George stopped for a second and said, by the way, I'm giving you a 0.5% royalty on the first book, because I had no royalty on the first book. And I said, you don't have to do that, George. I'm perfectly happy with the contract I signed. He said, no, you did a good job. I want you to have it. And I didn't think much of it at the time. I mean, a 0.5% royalty is about as small a royalty as you can get. But when it's a small royalty on what turns out to be a big book, it actually amounts to a few extra dollars, very much worthwhile. So that was very nice of George. You asked how we got along. There's a good example. So I had a 0.5% royalty on the first book, which I didn't originally have in the contract. So that's Star Wars. As far as Alien goes, I've done the novelizations of Aliens, second film, Alien 3. I did not do the novelization of Alien Resurrection, even though I was asked to, for reasons I can explain later if you want. Many years then passed, and I ended up doing the novelization of Alien Covenant, plus a prequel novel called Alien Origins, or Alien Covenant Origins. The subsequent books, the last two that I mentioned, those were with a different regime, different publisher. Everything's been fine with them. On the first three books, I had a standard novelization, standard advance plus royalty arrangement.
Who was the publisher?
Sorry?
Who was the publisher?
The original publisher was Warner Books.
Okay. And what about Star Wars books?
The original publisher with all the Star Wars books was Del Rey from the very beginning.
Okay. So that is
but subsequent to the Disney Corporation's purchases of both 20th Century Fox, which then had regained the rights to the Alien books, and Lucasfilm, which had the rights to all the Star Wars books prior to The Force Awakens and such, things became complicated royalty-wise. The subsequent books, in the case of Star Wars, The Force Awakens, and The Approaching Storm, there's never been a problem with that as far as royalties. And with the subsequent Alien books, which are published by Titan Books, Alien Covenant and Alien Covenant Origins, not a problem with that. The problem arose, and I'm sure most of your listeners are aware of this problem because it's been all over the news in the last few months, because of the purchase by Disney of Fox and Lucasfilm. And when you're trying to mesh not two, but three huge entertainment conglomerates, or any two or three businesses, things sometimes get lost in the shuffle. And in the case of the books that I just mentioned, those original books, their royalty reports apparently got lost in the shuffle for rather a number of years, to the point to where it became more than a private issue. Not that anybody wanted that. I certainly didn't want that. Nobody wanted it. But sometimes until you shine a light on something, it stays in the dark.
Yeah, and you had been talking with them by mail and various means about the reports and the residuals for quite some time before you discussed it with anybody else other than your agent.
Well, my agency was, and my agents were, and they couldn't really get an answer back from Disney. Again, you're dealing with lower level people at a giant corporation. This thing is not unheard of, but it's not good. And basically couldn't get an answer, and finally did get an answer. The short version of which was essentially, yes, we bought 20th Century Fox and Lucasfilm. We acquired their assets. We did not acquire their obligations. And this speaks to a point of not just copyright law, but a much wider range of law in general. It's not a good precedent. And obviously, we challenged it. And when nothing happened for a little while, then the Science Fiction Fantasy Writers of America, SFWA, got involved. And the only way to get a response, it was determined, was to go public with it, which again, nobody wanted, and suddenly it went viral within 24 hours. And lo and behold, subsequent to that, some serious talk ensued between the Virginia Kid Agency, which is my agency and always has been, and Disney, and things are progressing. And that's all I can say at this point.
Yeah, this is something that is in progress. We can mention that there was a very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal. And we can also mention that there was a three-way video with you, Mary Robinette Kowal of the Science Fiction Fantasy Writers of America, and Vaughn Hansen, who is a principal at the Virginia Kid Agency. And anybody who wants to see that can go on Facebook to the SFWA group. I know it's Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, but they only added the fantasy later, so it's still SFWA, SFWA. And it's a 25-minute video, and it lays things out fairly well. It's including where necessary, some no comments, because this is a legal work in progress.
Yes, and as I say, as they would say in Hollywood, my people are talking to the mouse's people, and
But
things are moving.
There was a long period where nobody was squeaking.
Yeah. Hopefully, this will all be resolved very shortly.
Good.
And when it is, it will be announced. But sometimes you have to be in a position sometimes to where you can speak up. And apparently, there have been other writers in similar situations who are also now being communicated with. And so, on that basis alone, it's been an awkward but useful discussion.
And this has happened, I think, to all kinds of writers. For some reason, particularly genre writers. I know it's happened a lot with Westerns and certain mysteries, but it's also just happened to lots of people who were with, smaller publishers like Lancer Books, if there's anybody in the world who remembers them. And they got bought. I don't think anything ever happened to the titles they owned, but books continued to be sold. And the purchaser of those companies did not think that they had the obligation to pay out on the contracts, that the original contracts with writers. And this is, by the way, I understand, not true only in writing. I understand this is a problem that happens in many industries, that a company gets bought and the purchaser doesn't believe that they owe the obligations.
Well, there are terrible things that happen. Most notably, you'll have a corporate raider come in. They'll buy a company. They'll raise money. They'll usually borrow money. They'll raise money and they'll buy a company. and then they will sell off the most valuable assets of that company. The money will go to quote unquote shareholders, and then what's left, they'll declare bankruptcy. That will usually include the pension fund for the unfortunate workers from that company.
Yeah.
And the people who bought it in the first place will depart with a nice profit, leaving behind the detritus of the company and the lives and pensions of the people who work for it. This happens every day
It's
in
called
America and
asset
Europe.
tripping, I believe.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a terrible, terrible thing.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about with regards to books is essentially that, the asset being the writer's work, on a much, much smaller scale. If you're going to deal with a small publisher, for example, could give you many, many examples of this sort of thing happening, because people who write are anxious and desperate to be published. There was an outfit called Aeolian Press, which did hardcover editions of the Star Trek logs, which I wrote. Nobody even knew about them until somebody saw some of the books. They were very nice books. They were done without dust jackets on library quality paper. But they never, not only did they not pay royalties to Del Rey Books, which owned the rights, so that Del Rey could then pay a portion of that to the writers, they didn't even announce that they were doing this. They just went ahead and did these books. It was like somebody doing self-binding and printing out of their house.
Yeah.
And when they were discovered, of course, they were shut down. But nobody knows, they didn't get off with tens of millions of dollars, but they must have made some money off those books. I know a lot of them were sold to libraries. The libraries had no idea what they were buying. You can still find these books online and in places. They're very nice books. But the person who, quote unquote, published them, as far as I know, never paid anybody concerned who actually owned the rights, whether it was Del Rey Books or Paramount or the writers or anybody else.
Yeah. And they have their market set up for libraries, which is a great market. If you could just sell to libraries as a publisher, and they can command large prices for books by the educational nature of what they're doing, they charge more for the book itself. So libraries pay out, they get grants, and the publisher gets a lot of money. It would be nice if they owned what they're selling.
There's an excellent publishing house, I guess it's still in business in Britain, called Severin House. And they were set up, as I understand it, originally, to publish books exclusively for library use. So you have acid-free paper and nice bindings and nice dust jackets. And somewhere along the line, they discovered that science fiction readers, particularly, would pay money, same money, for these books, because in a lot of cases, they were the only hardcover editions of these books. They've done a number of my books that are, in some cases, the only hardcover editions. And very nice books indeed. So that was, I guess, a little subsidiary stream of income for the publisher outside of their sales to libraries. Publishing industry is fascinating, just fascinating. All these little things that you're not aware of unless you're closely involved. People just buy a book and assume, that's it. They all come from Random House or Simon and Schuster or Harper's, and all kinds of interesting little things that go on that people are unaware of, unless you're a collector.
Right. But there is one other thing at the base of all of this, and that is, to quote Vaughn Hansen, who I'm sure, your agent, who I'm sure is not the first person to say this: a contract is a contract is a contract.
Well, one hopes. I mean, that's the way it's supposed to be.
But
we've had four. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, you're one of the first people in a position to actually litigate. Well, not litigate. We're not at that stage to argue and negotiate this issue.
Didn't want to. It was pressed upon me, or upon us, I should say, with regards to the agency. It's one thing if people will argue with you about, well, you're owed this much money, or you're not owed this much money, or you were owed money last year, but you're not owed money next year. it's a long way from that to saying you're not owed anything for the
Mhm.
work you did. If it's in the contract, the first line of the original Alien contract, the very first Alien book, says that this contract shall be binding upon the author, and then my name in parentheses, and the publisher, and Warner Books in parentheses, and their heirs and assigns. And it's not complicated. It's not complicated. You just go down the line and find out who the current heir and assign is for that property. And if you have that in your contract, there shouldn't be any argument or disagreement or disputation about the details. But in this particular case, there was. But as I say, we are talking, and I hope very much that it's all resolved. Say within the next month, certainly.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that, because this has been going on for at least 2 years, right?
Yeah.
There was a
Yes.
great deal of time. I mean, the pandemic may slow things down, but this has been going on for over 2 years. And for a long time, nobody was even responding to requests for information.
Well, it's all being sorted out, and hopefully it'll be consigned to the realms of contract history very shortly now.
But I'm hoping that history, I'm not just hoping, I believe this is an important history. I think that this is going to end up setting a precedent for a lot of people to whom this has happened. I know Mary Robinette Kowal has put out a call to writers that if you're within the science fiction fantasy world, you should talk to them. You should check out an organization called Writers Beware, which gives out a lot of very good information about a lot of dastardly and less than dastardly stuff. But it happens to manufacturers. It happens to a lot of people. And I hope you are setting precedent for setting these issues aright.
Well, I think it will. It shouldn't have to be. Shouldn't even be an issue. But sometimes opinions on contracts diverge, and you need to discuss them and bring them to a point to where both parties agree. And the end result is usually that both parties benefit from that agreement. That's the way you want it to be anyway.
Yeah.
Already, I can't speak for other writers, but I know there are other writers who are involved in this now. And as I say, hopefully it'll all be settled in a very short period of time.
I'm very pleased to hear that. Um, Before we change the subject, anything else on this specific thing that you'd like to mention or go on about? I again recommend to people to go to Facebook and watch that video.
It's very informative. I would second that recommendation. The only thing I can add is that pursuant to our discussion about film and TV adaptations, is I've been doing this for a very long time, obviously, and I often get asked a lot of the same questions, and there will come a point in time where I won't be around to answer these questions. It finally occurred to me that I ought to jot them down so that when I'm not around to answer the questions, people can still read the answers to them. So, a book coming out in April from Centipede Press called The Director Should Have Shot You, which details my involvement with film and television adaptations, starting with the very first one, Luana in 1973.
I think that could be made into a movie, by the way.
Luana? Oh, the story of Luana, of course, is kind of funny.
Yeah, well, I mean, your whole story with the director said.
Oh, that the director should have shot you.
Yeah.
Yeah, people will find answers to a lot of the things, and more exposition on subjects we've been talking about in that book. It's not a long book, but it's everything I could remember about every film that I ever adapted into book form. I didn't take notes when I was doing these things, but
It's very
I put down everything I could remember in relation to every film there is.
it's very
So
funny.
that comes in
Somehow
April.
you have an in with your agents. So
Okay,
I
there
actually
you
Virginia, so go that far back. Um, what what area have you not delved in your writing that you would like to?
I tried. I've written one mystery novel and several novelettes and novellas featuring the same character, but it's science fiction. The main character is a detective. So even though there's the usual mysteries involved, I don't consider that pure detective fiction. I did try one once. It's called Raw on the Road. Nobody, it's a short, turned out to be short. It's about 66,000 words. Needs to be expanded upon and have work done on it. And I might go back and revisit that again. But basically, I've explored every aspect of writing that I really wanted to do. I have a poem coming out in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. That'll be a first. Not the first published poem, the first one I've been paid for. And as you probably know, in April, I started writing orchestral music, which is something I always wanted to try.
No,
It
I
was
was not aware of that. Tell me
yeah,
about
it was complicated by the fact that A, I have no formal musical instruction in composition, and B, I can't play an instrument. So that kind of slowed me up for a few years. But some software has come out in the last few years that, if you persevere, enables you to do that sort of thing. I always heard music in my head sometimes when I was writing fiction, and now I have a way of jotting it down. I've done some short pieces and 3 symphonies, and I'm working on a symphonic poem right now. And whether anybody ever plays it or not, I don't know, but it's there, and I'll throw that back into whatever form my legacy takes, and somebody will discover it in 100 years and play it, and I won't get to hear it. But you know what the hey, at least I know I did it.
where can people find it? Is it in Shermer's? Has it been published at all?
No, none of it's been published. It hasn't even been submitted for publication. Uh, I wouldn't know how to do that. I could find out, but I'll get to that point maybe one of these days. There is on my Facebook fan page,
Right.
which Open Road Media, one of my publishers, runs. My favorite band is a Finnish symphonic metal band, which is a genre a lot of people in the United States aren't even aware of, but it's wonderful music. My favorite band's called Nightwish. So back when I was getting started doing this, there are 6 members in the band, and I did little 1.5, 2 minute musical impressions using the orchestra for each one of them. That's on the Facebook page if people want to listen to something. I hope I've gotten better since then, but at least if people want to get a basic idea of what I've been trying to do, that's up on that Facebook page, and they can listen to that. Again, bearing in mind that it's synthesized orchestral instruments. It's not a recording with the Vienna Philharmonic. So nothing's going to sound quite as deep and rich and realistic as it ought to, but at least it's something.
But you're joining that elite group of genre writers that have worked in music, sometimes satirical. Sorry, I did not mean to murder your name like that. Michael Moorcock, who played with Hawkwind, uh,
Right.
and there must be some others, but that puts you in a very elite group.
I leave it up to people to first listen to the music to decide if the word elite is applicable in my case.
Would you consider it classical?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely classical. Uses a full orchestra. The symphonic poem uses a full orchestra and wordless men's and women's choir, like Debussy did in Daphnis and Chloe.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's classical. I haven't tried writing popular songs or anything like that. Um, but this is what I always wanted to do. I always heard the music. The music was always in my head, but I had no, since I couldn't play an instrument, I had no way of getting it down in reproducible form. Now with the software, not only can you hear it, at least in something approximating a true orchestra, but the software will let you print out parts. So if somebody wanted to play it, say a college orchestra somewhere, simply send them the software, they can print out the parts, and lo and behold, it could be played. Um,
I'm going to ask a really weird one.
Go ahead.
How's about an opera?
I think, well, the next step, I've been wanting to do a cantata based on the Call of Cthulhu.
Okay.
But the software I'm using won't let me add words to the choir parts along with the orchestral parts. I can do choral parts separately and then the orchestral parts separately, or um, I can do lines for a wordless choir, which I'm doing in the symphonic poem.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't add words. When I figure out how to do that, an opera would, at least a one-act opera anyway, if nothing else, would seem to be a logical next step. And since nobody is really doing much in the way of science fiction or fantasy operas, I think that would be a lot of fun to do. We could have a singing dragon. I don't know, but
Mozart did it.
well,
No,
okay.
the dragon doesn't sing, does it? Just it appears on stage and gets slain almost immediately in Die Zauberflöte.
Yeah, well, I can see us trending towards some really bad puns at this point, so I'm going to back off.
Yeah. Okay.
Hot notes, and I said I would back off, and I didn't. But yeah, an opera would certainly be a doable thing as soon as I figure out how to work this software or get some different software that lets me put the words in actually with that. Because at this point, I think I've learned enough to where that wouldn't be an issue at all. It's really fun. The learning process, like Erasmus said, to stop learning is to start to die. It's really fun learning music, progressing from just writing notes to writing chords to adding articulations and, well, lots of things. So I'm having a good time with it. It's hard work for me.
I would think.
It's playable. If somebody wanted to play it, like I said, software lets you print out the parts real easy. It's fun. I would put something up on the screen here, but I can't do a dual screen, so you can't see what it looks like. But if you want later, I've sent Bill at the or Will, excuse me, Will at the Kid Agency some bits and pieces of the 3 symphonies.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're curious after we're through, just drop me a reminder email and I'll send you a movement from one of the symphonies anyway.
Oh, that'll be great. And I don't know what we can do about that in terms of hearing it on the radio, but I would love to explore that possibly.
Sure. My pleasure.
And obviously would be no problem for you to be both lyricist and composer.
Well, that's why the cantata appealed to me. And that's why an opera, I would think, would be an ultimate end part for that. Opera's not real big right now, but I said I'm going to do a cantata based on the Call of Cthulhu. What if we made it a musical comedy? We could probably do that too.
Uh-huh.
But we'd be in Little House. Well, nobody thought the Little House of Horrors would be a comedy musical either. But I think a straight opera would be more up my alley.
Yeah, and there have been a couple of successful Broadway, almost operatic works. Certainly, Sondheim has managed to do that with Passion, to a lesser extent, Sweeney Todd. But Passion, there's not a spoken word, and it's Sweeney Todd is performed at any number of opera houses. So, that's what's the name for those dime novels that they had in England? They had a very special name, Penny Murder Mysteries or something like that.
Not Grand Guignol.
No, that's a style. Well, it is Grand Guignol, but that's a style. No, the books that
Penny Dreadfuls.
that's it. The Penny Dreadfuls. That Sweeney Todd, which was originally called String of Pearls, when it was a Penny Dreadful. Who would imagine that could end up being performed at the Paris Opera, but it has.
There was a pretty good musical version of Forbidden Planet. I thought it was
I like
really,
that Return to
I
the.
liked it too.
I
I was
thought,
lucky enough to see it. I was lucky enough to see it on stage in London,
yeah.
and it was quite a production. It was quite a production. Music wasn't bad at all.
I went, as a matter of fact, with Chris Claremont to see it in New York. He had already seen the London production, and it came to Off Broadway in New York, to a old vaudevillian house, which had never stopped doing theater of one form, and it was a lot of fun.
It was. It
And
was.
somebody should revive that. I think there's
I,
all kinds of theater work in genre that can be done. Some of it has been done. I saw two excellent plays based on Philip K. Dick. Um, one was a bona fide adaptation of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and the other one was by the Mabu Mines Theater of Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said.
I'll give you two recommendations from an Italian symphonic metal parody band, which does excellent music, and one of whose principal contributors is a very prominent astrophysicist. And one is called Hallelujah, which is sort of a fantasy Christmas piece, a really great guitar riff. And there's another one called Uranus, which is about the planet,
Yes.
but is full of really terrible puns and a great deal of science. That may sound like an odd combination of people, but the video, which anybody can look up for either one of these two songs on YouTube, is they're both hilarious and the music is good. And Uranus, I don't want to spoil it for anybody. The band is called Nano War of Steel. Yep. And you have to look at these videos. These guys, Val Hallelujah is just maybe my favorite Christmas song in a very long time.
I'll be putting this video up on YouTube among other places.
Okay.
I will link to those from
Okay.
this video. You reminded me, by the way, Fred Hoyle wrote modern classical music that is a little more on the John Cage spectrum of
No.
not.
My music is actually music. I mean, it's for instruments to actually play, and there are melodies and rhythms and all of those things that most of us associate with music as opposed to mathematics.
I had the fortune or misfortune of engineering a radio show for Mr. John Cage for a few weeks. We won't go there.
Okay. No, that's not my thing.
I think to an extent he was actually a prankster. I think that he actually knew that a certain amount of what he was doing was putting people on.
Well, in that regard, he certainly succeeded.
But there are people who get their doctorates studying him. So be that as it may. I've also seen operas, by the way, using 12-tone, including one of Little Women that was done by the Houston Opera Company, brought to, it was at City Opera in New York. I was amazed that I could listen to it. I actually enjoyed it.
Well, for them that wants it, I'm glad it's there. I'll write rap music before I write 12-tone. So
it's difficult stuff, but Bernstein wrote 12-tone, so but for
you know, when it becomes the newest thing, suddenly it's a thing. The only way these things actually, any creative enterprise is validated is by history.
Yeah.
And so you need to come back in 200 years and see if anybody is still playing this music, reading this books, or looking at this art.
I totally agree. How about straight theater for you?
I did that when I was at UCLA. I wrote a play when I was at UCLA. It was based on the Spanish Inquisition in Peru.
I expect that, sir.
But I never did anything with it. It was a student exercise.
Uh-huh.
And I could do it. but there's only so many hours in the day. And mine are pretty much spoken for. I mean, when you add writing symphonies to writing novels, that doesn't leave you with a whole lot of time at my age to experiment, because other things like food, sleep, changing cat boxes tend to take up more of your time than they did when you were, like, as you well know, 25 or 30 years old.
Yeah.
I'm always interested in trying new things, looking at new things, doing new things. But once I've done that, I have to pick and choose among which of those things I want to spend my time on.
What are you spending your time on now?
Well, writing orchestral music.
Okay, that's most of your output at this point.
Well, today, and I have several books that haven't been published yet, recent books, and while we're waiting for a publisher to pick those up, I'll work on the music. When those are picked up, I'll write another book.
Very
And then
good.
there are the various movie projects, which I have to be at least peripherally involved with. Or, when people write, I mean, there are people who've had things like the Spellsinger books and the Pippin Flinks books under option, not just under option, but are actively trying to get them made into films.
I'm shocked it hasn't happened.
Well, that's the nature of the business. It's who you know. I'll give you a good example. I don't particularly like pitching story properties, but there's a well-respected old line film TV producer named William McCutcheon. The book I mentioned earlier, The Directorship of Shot, is dedicated to him, who loves science fiction. And he's had the rights to a number of my books and to the Harry Harrison stainless steel rat books for many, many years. This is a gentleman who spent his life in the business and has been trying very hard to get these various properties actually made. And we went into Universal a number of years ago and sat down with a vice president of production. No need to mention his name. We expected to have 10 minutes, and he ended up spending about 40 minutes with us. And we pitched two books to him: The Eye Inside and the detective science fiction series that I mentioned to you, where the main book, the book there was The Mocking Program. And when it was all over and done, he said, well, I really like The Mocking Program. You can see where that would be more appealing to a studio producer, but we can't do it. And so both Bill and I said, why? And he said, Universal only does 2 science fiction / fantasy projects a year. And they either have to have a major talent already attached, or they have to be based on a best-selling property. And the 2 projects they did that year were iRobot with Will Smith.
Oh, God.
The obvious reason that Will Smith wanted to do it. And I forget the title of the other one, was about basically vampire hunter. Van Helsing. The other one was Van Helsing. Because stories have been around forever. I can't remember the name of the critic who said about iRobot. He said, the only thing missing from the film version of Isaac Asimov's iRobot is Isaac Asimov.
Yeah. The same is sadly true of the current TV series of The Watch, based on Terry Pratchett.
Been watching that.
What his daughter says, I think, is a good summation, where she says it's missing Pratchett's DNA. And
I would agree with that. It's great. But...
yeah, I would recommend, if anybody wants to see whether or not Terry Pratchett can be brought to television well, there's a wonderful production of The Color of Magic that starred Sean Astin, and another one of Hogfather with Michelle Dockery, and beautifully done. Each one is 4 hours. They also did Going Postal, which I didn't care for quite as much, but it's still a lot of fun. Start Claire Foy.
And of course, we have the adaptation of Good Omens, which Brad Terry did with Neil Gaiman.
Yeah, and Gaiman was at least able to shepherd that himself.
Right. That's what happens is so many of these projects get done after the original artist creator passes on, and then they have no input at all. A good example of that would be Childhood's End, which was originally optioned by Arthur P. Jacobs, who went on to do the Planet of the Apes films,
Right.
which nobody could get made for 60 years, and which finally did get done as a miniseries for TV. Not bad at all, but an extremely difficult book to adapt. That's the thing with a lot of science fiction. It's very, very difficult to get. Science fiction is the literature of ideas. It's very difficult to show ideas on film in a way that will engage an audience. The two best science fiction films I've seen of the last several years are both based on stories by, surprise, surprise, science fiction writers. One is The Arrival.
Thank you.
Based on a story by Ted Chiang.
Brilliant, wonderful story called The
Brilliant film. Brilliant film. Very difficult, I think, for a general audience.
Yeah.
But real science fiction. And the other one is Annihilation, based on a book by Jeff Vandermeer.
Also not a simple book.
Exactly, and not simple films. And Dune isn't going to be simple either.
It'll be interesting. Denis Villeneuve has, I admired, well, he made Arrival. And right. I admired what he did with his sequel to Blade Runner. So it'll be interesting to see, at least this fellow gets science fiction. He understands what it's about. Exactly.
There was a film made a fair number of years ago, which Roger Ebert, I think, was the only major film critic who actually read science fiction, put on his best 10 of the year list, a film called Dark City.
Yes. I like that. Those are good.
Outstanding science, real science fiction.
Yeah.
But it would be very difficult to get it made today. Never mind that you couldn't afford the cast. But if somebody wants to see a slightly older, really good science fiction film, that one runs on cable all the time. Yeah.
And I would recommend one, pardon me, I have to plug something in here. I would also recommend one that few people have probably heard of, but is now available for streaming, called The Quiet Earth.
Yes.
A movie from New Zealand.
It's not what at least the US film audience has been trained to expect in the way of science fiction films.
Right, but it's, I thought, always an excellent film. So it can
Absolutely.
be done.
Oh, yes. It just takes money and somebody with the power to get the film made behind it, whether it's a name, the talent behind it. Let's put it that way. Whether it's a name, actor, director, you need it from that respect. So yeah, it's certainly a better situation for with regard to science fiction films than it was, say, 30, 40 years ago.
Well, I work in an industry.
We're starting.
Oh, sorry, go on, please.
No. Another film I wanted to mention was Moon, which is essentially a one-person film, but is real science fiction.
And directed
all of these things are possible to do.
And of course,
yes.
Duncan Jones was, his father was a huge science fiction fan and wrote the play Lazarus. And for those who don't know, Duncan Jones's father is David Bowie, who was principal in the making of a fine Walter Tevis novel into a film, The Man Who Fell to Earth. Although I will have to say, and this is 30 years later, The Queen's Gambit by the same writer, Walter Tevis. It's 7 hours long. They're finally making things at the length they deserve to be made. And
well, that's what you have to do. You couldn't do you could never do Childhood's End as a 2-hour movie. That's one reason why it did never get made for so long.
Yeah. And when David Lynch wanted to make Dune, it was 7 hours, but of course they never let him get near it.
No, God forbid the original director, or even worse, the writer, should be allowed near the production.
Yeah, exactly. He tried to get his name taken off of that, as I recall. Herbert seemed to like the screenplay fine. I don't think he saw the final film, but I did interview him about the time the screenplay was going around, the David Lynch screenplay.
Right.
So,
Well, it's sad. I feel so bad for people. Frank did get money, which was a good thing.
yes.
But I always think of poor Phil Dick, who had all of these stories made into major films on stories and books that he was getting paid a penny and a half a word to write. So that's what happens. You die and then you get rich.
Yeah, and many of those films do not really represent his body of work. A few do, but they're the lesser known ones. Richard Linklater did an animated version of, oh God, the title is escaping me, but it was a fine movie. It was rotoscoped animation throughout. And
I know what you're talking about. I can't remember the title either.
yeah, and John Allen
Yeah,
did a very good one as well.
the rotoscoping technique was really fun to see, but for today's audiences, or for the audience at that time, it's almost experimental in the way it was put out, and it's just people didn't watch it. It's a shame.
Yeah,
And there's good stuff. We talk exclusively about American films. There's a lot of good stuff being done overseas in Europe too, and I'm looking forward to seeing The Wandering Earth, which is a Chinese film.
I'm very curious to see it. Advance Word, because it has been finished, it has been screened. Advance Word is not positive.
I reserve judgment until I see it.
Yeah, well, that's the only thing you can do. But there are people who are working between China, the company, I think in English, Tencent, who are working with people like Ken Liu and other folk to try to have some real intercourse between Chinese cinema and American writing and vice versa.
Well, I've been involved in that, as I mentioned earlier when I discussed Olympus briefly.
That's right.
In fact, the funny thing about that, when negotiations first began, since this was to be production was to be done in China, the crew of this first Mars settlement vessel was all Chinese. And the Chinese producer came back and said, no, half the crew has to be American, because for international box office purposes, because he knew that an all Chinese science fiction film, at least at that time, wouldn't fly internationally. It needed to have some American appeal. So this is what happens in not just the film industry, but most industries. Money trumps everything.
Yeah, it does. It does. But at least we are starting to see more international science fiction be printed in English. La Vie Tidar just put out an anthology that sort of picks up what Judith Merrill did with what was it, The Best of the Rest of the World, foreign science fiction, and Neil Clark at Clark's World has been publishing at least one Chinese story every month. And over at Adamant Press, for whom I do audio editing, between Nightmare Magazine, Fantasy Magazine, and Lightspeed Magazine, which I host, we've been doing a fair amount of Chinese, or I should say Asian and African science fiction and fantasy.
Well, it's become it's become a worldwide, not that it always hasn't been in some regard, but it's become a worldwide genre. People who read and have imaginations love science fiction no matter where they are. There are several Arabic science fiction associations.
Yeah.
There's a big one in India.
Oh, yes.
Japan, we all know about. There's even Arabic science fiction, which can be very usefully subversive, shall we say.
Yes.
And it's
And there's
everybody,
great Russian science fiction.
of course, everybody talks the same language essentially. It's just we're coming from slightly different places.
Yeah, and sometimes one, especially with some of the Russians, for example, you have to be a little subversive in order to get certain ideas through the way that the Strugatsky brothers did, and for that matter, Stanislav Lem, who was still writing under the Soviet Union in Poland, uh, did with Solaris and other things. But hopefully people are talking to each other.
I really need to get off and write a story where Putin's palace, which you may have read about recently, is actually a base for aliens. And that's why it's been kept secret in Russia. It has the skating rink and the movie theater and all of that is just covered for the underground alien base. And that's why they've been keeping it all quiet.
I'm looking forward to reading that. So yeah, I was just going to say one thing, which is for all this talk about all these movies, I work in a medium where our special effects are better. Radio.
Yes.
And ain't nobody, especially George Lucas, will argue that one.
I won't.
Here for it.
I won't.
Now, if only we can get a budget, maybe we can hire you to write some radio drama.
Well, I've done that too. It was a long time ago, but for a public radio station in Oregon, Sweet Home, Oregon, to be specific,
Yeah.
we wrote 12 radio dramas of scenes from American history.
Okay. And what station? Do you recall?
Oh, I don't remember the call letters, but I still have the tapes of the act. They sent me copies of the shows. They're each about 6, 7 minutes long.
Well,
And there was the Monitor and the Merrimack, things like that. That was a lot of
they're
fun.
sponsored radio, so
Yeah.
ought to be able to work something out with them. People ought to be able to hear it in New York.
Yeah, well, one can hope.
One can hope. So if you're going to write that story, and if I'm going to get this online and broadcast the audio, a good portion of this coming Saturday, to make our mutual friends at the Virginia Kid Agency happy, we should probably bring this to a close. We were talking a good 20 minutes before we started recording. We're at 1 hour and 36 minutes, and my show runs 1 hour.
You get to edit.
I get to edit the audio. I'm good at that, but we'll put the entire video up on both Facebook and YouTube. No.
Okey-dokey.
So best of luck. I hope that it's not another 19 years before we get to do this again. I'll get in touch if there's anything you'd like to say, and with your permission, either through your agent or directly, I'll get in touch with you and we can ramble on some other time. Maybe when the pandemic's over, I'll be in the station and we can take listener calls.
That would be very nice.
It would. I'm looking forward to going back to live radio, which are my roots.
That would be very nice, Jim.
Okay, so thank you so much, Alan.
My pleasure.
Okay. And now I figure out how to stop recording. I'm still new. There we are.